We never know what kind of crowd we're going to get on a beautiful autumn day. And we're tickled pink to see so many people here today. We want to welcome you. But before we do that, I want to remind everyone, Friday, October 18th, John Lugard, I'm getting ahead of myself, is going to be discussing Singing in the Rain. He's a physician and a filmmaker, and I understand we're in for a huge treat. When I was a full-time teacher, the Maritime Museum in Virginia was a treasured resource. It had programs that dovetailed the Vermont Social Studies curriculum, allowing history to come alive for students and to enhance learning. This afternoon, one of the Maritime Museum's staff archaeologists and divers will take us on a deep dive into Lake Champlain's shipwrecks, and we will also get an introduction to some of the opportunities that are available to the public. It is with great pleasure we welcome Taylor Picard.
This is actually a really great turnout. I'm very excited to be here to talk with all of you. So yeah, as Jan said, I'm going to be talking about Lake Champlain and some of the archaeological perspectives from the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, and also some of our education programs and other public programs that we have to offer at the museum. So I'll introduce myself, go a little bit about me, introduce the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, just in case any of you haven't been there or don't know what that is. I'll talk a little bit about what is archaeology, then specifically maritime archaeology, give a brief history of Lake Champlain. Then we'll talk about the Vermont Underwater Historic Preserve, which is one of my main parts of, this is one of the main parts of my job at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, and it also helps afford me to come out here and do things like this. We'll talk a little bit more about some other shipwrecks, and then a future of the museum where we are going to be working on putting together a citizen science program, and then we'll have a nice Q&A. So I've been working in archaeology for about 8 years now, coming up on 9. I started as an undergrad at Humboldt State University, which is now Cal Poly Humboldt in Northern California. I graduated in 2019. While I was there, I worked for California State Parks, state archaeologist Greg Collins, and a couple of the smaller organizations in Northern California, particularly PAR Environmental Services. At that time, I also did some projects down in New Mexico and did a lot of work down the Southwest, which is quite a bit different from going into maritime archaeology, going from very dry climate with about 10% precipitation to jumping right into the water. In 2019, I moved to North Carolina and got my master's degree at East Carolina University in maritime archaeology. During that time, I came up and I interned at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum in 2021, right when they were starting to kick off their project on the Arnold's Bay shipwrecks, which is just right outside of the museum. It's just south of Budden Bay, which is really fortunate because it's nice and easy drive right from the museum to get out there. While I was working on my master's degree, my thesis was looking at U.S. Army aircraft rescue boats from World War II, specifically one that is part of the Mallows Bay Ship Graveyard in Mallows Bay, Maryland. And fortunately, we have one of the exact same shipwrecks in Lake Champlain, right off of Alcor Island on the other side of the island from where the battle happened. It's a really fun coincidence, and it's actually how I started dialoguing with the museum, and that eventually led to my photogrammetry internship. I just returned to the museum this year in June. After finishing my master's degree in 2022, I moved to Northern California, and then I just moved back. And currently I'm focused on implementing advanced technologies at the museum to further archaeology research, public outreach, and a citizen science program. So the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum was founded in 1985. It was originally part of the Champlain Maritime Society. It started off in this just little stone schoolhouse. It's a historic building. It's still on campus. It's actually where we house the Abenaki exhibit. And from there, it has expanded into a 3-acre waterfront campus that serves the broader community of Lake Champlain, but has become a big part of Addison County. We do a lot with the schools out there, a lot of the school programs like Jan mentioned, and specifically we have what's known as our boat builder program. So we have 2 different groups this year, and they work on building a rowboat, and all of these rowboats are actually on display at the museum. They all stay in the water and they get used by the community. It's a really awesome program and I'm a really big fan of it. So as you can see here, our mission is to connect all people of Lake Champlain, inspire them to learn from the past and build together in the present to create a sustainable future. So, you know, that involves a lot of outreach. So coming in here and doing talks like this, but also reaching out to our youth group because they are our future, and, you know, showing them what sustainability looks like and how that's important to Lake Champlain and also how that's important to all of our lives. So here's some examples of what we do. You can see on the far left, we have what's known as our Great Map. This shows the entire watershed of the Lake Champlain Basin. This is a huge map. It would take up most of the space in this room. You can see it down on the bottom left, where there's a bunch of kids and it's laid out on the field. It's quite big. And then here's some of the examples of the boat building program, our rower program, and some of our education outreach programs. We also do help test for cyanobacteria around the lake. We are a testing site within ourselves, and we report that back to the larger organization that monitors cyanobacteria throughout the lake. This year, thankfully, we did not have any. Let's go. I think that's always very exciting, which is also important because, you know, we have these youth summer camps that come, you know, almost back to back to back throughout the summer, and they're down there on the waterfront. So it's really nice to know when, you know, the water is safe that they can go out and interact with the water. So specifically, what I do is I work in the research and archaeology department. So we manage what's known as the dive preserves, or the historic Vermont underwater preserves, which is a system of shipwrecks that is open to the public, that they are allowed to go visit and go dive on, and they're protected in such a way so that way there's a mooring line and they can bring their boat up, hook up to the mooring line, dive down, and have a safe dive on the shipwreck without risking damage to the shipwreck by tossing an anchor overboard or anything like that. Additionally, we are an official curator and repository for the U.S. Navy, as well as the state of Vermont and the state of New York. So we manage archaeological collections for all 3 of those, as well as other various smaller museums. And we produce research that is available to the public, as well as our collections. Oftentimes, you know, we bring those out and we use that for public outreach and talking. So a really good example is just earlier this week on Monday, our boat building group from Middlebury High School went down to Arnold's Bay. We met them there. We brought some artifacts and maps, and we showed them the work that we've been doing. They got to interact with the map, the artifacts that we have. Quite a few of them are really avid fishermen, and last year we found a fishing hook, an iron fishing hook on the wreck, and they just went nuts over it. They were so excited. They were comparing it to the fishing hooks they have. It was amazing. It was such a great time. I always really enjoy when they get super excited about stuff like that, and the fact that it's something just simple as a fishing hook. It's just amazing. So we are in the middle of currently updating our inventory as we have collections all the way back from the 1980s, as well as stuff that's been donated to us by the public. So it's this ongoing effort, and we are updating not only our catalog, but also the storage space. So actually in 2 weeks, we're updating our storage space. It's very exciting, and it's all going to be nicely organized. And part of that is also creating an online inventory so people can see what our collections look like, and it'll be available to researchers. So archaeological research at the museum is largely grant funded, but we also do cultural resource management, otherwise known as contract archaeology. So some of that right now is working on the Champlain Hudson Power Express transmission line that's going through Lake Champlain, as well as the Hudson River and the Harlem River. So we're actually involved in all parts of that, where it's underwater as a subcontractor to another company. We evaluate all of the data. We tell them, you know, is there a shipwreck there, where to avoid, and things like that, and analyze all of that data. So that way there's a clean route for them to go through. In fact, just a week and a half ago, we finished up clearing a route through the Great Bridge that connects Fort Ticonderoga to Mount Defiance. And because the route is going through two of the caissons. So we did a metal detecting survey and cleared the route for them to make sure that they're not going to damage any archaeological resources there. You know, and this is one of the funny things about contract archaeology is we always want to find stuff, but we also don't. It's a paradox. It's great because I love it. Thankfully, we didn't find anything, so we know that nothing's going to get damaged or disturbed. But we're also slightly disappointed because we found, you know, just a lot of old pop tops, or as we call them in archaeology, pull tabs. Additionally, we do a lot of conservation of archaeological material. So anything that we would have pulled up from that project, we would have conserved in our lab, and then it would have gone over to the New York State Museum in this instance, because sometimes it depends on contract to contract. So this time it would have gone to the New York State Museum, and they would have held on to it after we finished conservation. But we also do conservation for the Navy, which has a very strict protocol. So I'll talk about that a little bit later with the work that we've been doing on the Rogue Galley Congress from the Revolutionary War. But we also do a lot of just conservation of the archaeological material that we conserve as well. So for those of you that might not know, archaeology is not digging up dinosaurs. I get that question, I feel like every week. So I like to just emphasize that. So we are a subfield of anthropology. Specifically, we study humans of the past through what they leave behind in their material culture. This is what we know as cultural resources. So oftentimes in the terrestrial archaeology world, what this looks like is conducting large pedestrian surveys across the landscape, and you know, we do a bunch of historical review before that to make sure we are, you know, really targeting areas of significance. But we cover all areas anyways, just to make sure that something that doesn't show up in the historical review we can still find. We're also constantly implementing new technologies such as satellite imagery and laser scanning, specifically known as LiDAR, which is light detection and ranging. They fly a plane over, it takes a ton of laser pulses on the ground and produces really nice like landscape maps where we can remove all the trees and the brush and we can see what the actual ground looks like. And additionally, we use a lot of metal detectors, especially in areas of, you know, battlefields and conflicts where we would expect to see, you know, a lot of firearm usage and things like that. But they also have really good uses in historic homesteads as well. Unfortunately, not all of those work underwater, but I'll talk about that on the next slide. So once we do find a new site, we heavily document it. That's before we even break dirt, basically. Once we do start excavating, we really go into a lot of details and take a lot of notes, working typically in about 10 centimeter levels and just documenting exactly where everything is found. This is known as provenience in context. So that all helps add data that we can later use for interpreting archaeological sites. So then recovered material we then curate and then if it's Native American, belongs to a tribe, we will repatriate it. Or what's happening a lot nowadays is we'll return the material back to the site so that way it stays in equilibrium. So a lot of times these artifacts have come to a stable state inside the environment that we find them in, and it's better to leave them there instead of taking them out and conserve them, because we could still be losing material through conservation. Ultimately, this is another part of this. The reason we're doing that is because there is a nationwide curation crisis. We have so much material that it is hard to generate the space for that. When I was a student, I went to the Arizona State Museum, which is on the University of Arizona campus, and I kid you not, it looks like the ending of Raiders of the Lost Ark, with a huge warehouse that's like 2 or 3 stories tall, and it's just floor to ceiling with boxes of archaeological material. It is amazing, but also a little scary. So specifically the subfield of maritime archaeology, which is what I do, we focus on how people interact with the water. Oftentimes it involves an archaeology component, but not always. There's plenty of fishing sites that are on land, or if lakes are experiencing a drought, those resources become exposed, and things like that. So in Lake Champlain, as I'll mention, we have a lot of different activities that are happening, and all of them fall under the realm of maritime archaeology. So we use a lot of the same methods, but they're slightly different. So instead of doing big pedestrian surveys, we're conducting big remote sensing surveys, where we'll use tools like side scan sonar or marine magnetometer to map the lake bottom. And from there, we'll find the targets that we're looking for, and then we'll deploy a diver, and then that diver will search the bottom for the target that we identified. If the contract requires it, then we will excavate and remove that material, and that way we can conserve it and make sure it doesn't get damaged by whatever's happening. So a good example is the Chippy project. If we did find material, we would have removed it, brought it back to our lab, conserved it, and then I believe that material was actually going to go get conserved or be stored at Fort Ticonderoga or the New York State Museum. So in that one, we knew where we were looking because they did a side scan sweep, and they identified where 2 of the caissons were, and we wanted to make sure there was no material between them. So we went in with a metal detector, and we did surveys with the whole grid and everything underwater, and made sure that there was nothing there. The underwater environment is very tricky to work in. We get great preservation of material. Lake Champlain has some of the most unique shipwreck preservation in the world, but it's a tricky environment to work in because that material is very sensitive once you remove it out of the water, and it will start to deteriorate very quickly if we don't do conservation rapidly, particularly with wood or organic objects, because what happens is that water will penetrate the cell as the cell is dying, or in terms of wood, it's already dead, but it'll penetrate the cell, and as we remove it out and it starts to dry, the cells will start to deform because they start to lose that water, and the wood will warp and twist, and then it'll start just to shed and fall apart. Additionally, different artifact types that we find have different preservation strategies. So in terms of wood and organics, we use what's known as PEG, P-E-G. It's polyethylene glycol, which will then replace the water in the cells, but it also makes them very soft, so they're not incredibly structurally sound. But when it comes to iron artifacts, we use electrolytic reduction, where we run electricity through the artifact while it's submerged in a water mix of deionized water and 5% sodium carbonate, and that sheds the rust off of the material, and then we'll treat it with tannic acid and boil it and then put a wax coat on it. And that's why, when you see a conserved iron object, it's not shiny like you would expect metal to be, it's black. And that's actually from the conservation material that we have to put over it. So this is the example of what a side scan sonar survey looks like. We have our boat, and we have what's known as a towfish, and then we'll create channels onto either side, and that is sending a sonar signal out, and then the reflection is the sonar image that we will then use to determine where material is. So it's really great for finding anomalies on the bottom. And in fact, between 1996 and 2004, we mapped almost the entire lake bottom and have created an inventory of shipwrecks through that. So through that, we found about 200 shipwrecks. We believe that there are still more because there are limitations both at the time of the sonar that we were using, but also where you can deploy that sonar, because there's plenty of shipwrecks that are in shallow water that we can't access with the side scan sonar. Additionally, another tool we use is known as a marine magnetometer. So this detects changes in the the Earth's magnetic field that's caused by large pieces of metal as they put off their own magnetic field, and we're able to look at the signature of the Earth's magnetic field and see how it's being disrupted by other metal objects. Of course, this doesn't work with all metal objects, it's mostly just ferrous. But then when we do find an anomaly, we send a diver down, or what's known as a ROV, or remote operated vehicle, to go inspect the anomaly, and then we'll develop a strategy of, are we going to preserve it in place, or does it need to be excavated? So just a quick history of Lake Champlain. Pre-1906, we have what is known as the Native American occupation period. And then 1906, Champlain comes into Lake Champlain, and we experience the first European contact. So the next 55 years is the contact period when French and English settlers and Dutch settlers begin to move into Lake Champlain and start setting up colonies here. Following that, we have about 100 years of different conflicts going on as the nations are fighting to have the territory in order to exploit the natural resources of Lake Champlain. The key part of this is the French and Indian War, which is around 1755 to 1763. The next 10 years later, we see the American Revolution happen on Lake Champlain. This really is mostly in the form of the Battle of Valcour Bay in 1776, where Benedict Arnold fought the British fleet that came down from St. John. And, in effect, he lost the battle, but caused a delaying action that forced the British to stop their invasion up the lake for the rest of the winter, which gave the American forces enough time to refortify at Fort Ticonderoga that winter and be more prepared for the British in 1777. Then we also have the settlement and commercialization. So this is sort of the big boom of Lake Champlain, is now that these settlements are more established and all unified under the United States, a lot of commerce starts happening in the lake, and there becomes an identified need to connect Lake Champlain to the Hudson River, so that way the natural resources on the lake and the materials that are being produced up here can get down to New York without having to go through Canada. This is really kind of marked just at the prelude to the War of 1812, where we put an embargo on Canada and we can no longer ship items north. Then comes the War of 1812. This is another conflict period, marked mostly by the Battle of Plattsburgh Bay, right outside of Plattsburgh, New York, where this time, using a very similar strategy, the Americans actually win the battle. Some could argue by a lucky shot, damaging the anchor of the Confiance, taking it effectively out of the battle, but also just very good command in terms of the American side, and probably has more to do with the expertise of the American Navy at that time compared to the Revolutionary War, where we didn't really have sailors. A lot of the folks that were on these boats were mostly farmers and fishermen and hunters and loggers and things like that. Following that, we see the creation of the canal system that connects Lake Champlain to the Hudson River, and now Lake Champlain is connected to the Atlantic Ocean on both the north end and the south end, and this created a huge commercial boom that would ultimately wrap up around 1945 as the railroad industry came in and effectively knocks out the canal boat industry, which then leads into our current era, which is the recreational period. There are some talks that we might be in a new era on Lake Champlain, the era of preservation, where we're constantly fighting to prevent the spread of zebra mussels, the introduction of quagga mussels, preserving the historic resources of the lake as well as the natural resources. I like to think so, but we'll see what the next couple of years show us. So, as I mentioned before, one of our key jobs at Lake Champlain is management of the Vermont underwater dive preserves. So this is a group of 12 shipwrecks. We just added 2 this year. It was 10 before, that are open to the public for recreational diving. They all have a mooring buoy and a mooring block down at the bottom, so boats can come up, they hook onto the mooring block, divers can get in the water and follow the line down, and they'll end up on the mooring block, which then has a line that leads out to the wreck. And then they can, do dives around the wreck without risking endangering the wreck and things like that. And we do constant inspections of these wrecks to make sure they're staying in good condition and they're not being damaged too much by, both the natural occurrences that happen, but also, divers accidentally, running into the wreck and things like that, because visibility could get pretty bad sometimes down there. So this is operated by the Vermont Division of Historic Preservation, and we just manage it. And we report back to them. They give us a grant, and we report back to them every year and let them know what the condition of the wrecks are. So the goal for this program, and we do plan on continuously expanding it, is to protect these wrecks, because archaeological resources are non-renewable. We can't just, lose a wreck and then make a new one, because they're 2 unique wrecks. One wreck that we lose because it deteriorates is gone. We'll never get that information back. And while we're sure there could be a new wreck that becomes historic or significant in that time, it's different and it really can't replace the data that we lose. So we're really trying to preserve these wrecks so that everyone can enjoy them and have safe dives and make sure that they live into perpetuity. So while these are free for people to go dive on, we do ask that they register annually, so that way we can keep track of what the who's coming and who's seeing them and things like that. Yeah. Oh, yes, it is a diver, so that's actually our executive director, Chris Sabick. It is sort of a hard to see image because it's very dark down on the bottom and it's a little older, so so that's Chris. He's hovering right above a wreck. He does have a light in his hands. He's doing an inspection. It's a little hard to see, I'm sorry. I will say that image is in our new exhibit at the museum. And it's on like a big photo blow up. So, if you can't see it here, come visit the museum. You can see it there. This is a good point for me to add that the museum is free. So you should definitely come check it out. And we did just open up a great new exhibit, which does talk about canal boats. And we do have a whole section specifically, if you're familiar with the Lewis McClure, the replica canal boat that we had, does tell the whole story of the Lewis McClure. So I'm going to talk about some of the shipwrecks that we have in Lake Champlain. The first couple are going to be the shipwrecks that are part of our dive preserve. So this is the Champlain 2. The Champlain 2 is part of the shipwreck tour that we offer during the summer. If you are lucky enough to go out there and I'm on board, I get to fly the ROV down. You guys can see what the wreck looks like in the current condition. It's always a lot of fun. I enjoy it, and we have another interpreter on board that will tell you the whole story, but I'll give you the abbreviated version. So the Champlain 2 was originally built in 1868 as a train ferry. So its main purpose was to transport trains from one side of the lake to the other before they had any of the trestles built to cross the lake. It was originally known as the Oaks Aim. In 1874, it was bought up by the Champlain Transportation Company, and they changed the name to the Champlain 2. Now, it's maybe a sailor's myth, but changing the name of the shipwreck is typically seen as a bad sign and will bring bad luck. I would say that is the case here, because the next year, almost to the day, the shipwreck ran aground. So it ended on the night of July 16th, 1875, when pilot John Elridge and L. Rockwell changed shifts, and it was late at night. They had just finished going up to Westport, New York, and from there they were going to change shifts and go from Westport, New York up to Plattsburgh, New York. And at this point, it was a passenger ferry, very similar to the Ticonderoga at the Shelburne Museum, if you've ever seen it. Well, while heading out of Westport, it ran aground, and it actually ran up on the rocks. And Rockwell, who was the pilot that took over at that shift, is in the pilot house, and Elridge, who's just about to go to sleep, he had a long 12-hour shift, goes rushing into the pilot house, and Rockwell turns around and says, "Can you account for my being on the mountain?" Which is very weird, because your boat's supposed to be on the water, not on a mountain. And then he takes off. He runs off into the forest. He's not seen again for the next couple of days. Meanwhile, Elridge successfully evacuates everybody off the boat, because the nice thing about running around on the mountain is the land's right there, and you don't have to worry about anyone jumping in the water. There was one individual who the cabin boy found him passed out on his bed, floating on water as it was filling up, and went screaming out, "He's dead, he's dead!" And Elridge, who had a little bit cooler head on his shoulders, goes in, finds him. He wasn't dead. He had just passed his bar exam in New York and did his due diligence to examine some other bars in New York. So, luckily he got off and there's no injuries. The next couple of days, Rockwell shows up, and they conduct an investigation. They find that he's very well known by all the pharmacists and all the ports that he's been visiting. And that's because for several years he had been using laudanum to treat gout. And he was intoxicated on the laudanum the night that the wreck had happened.
That'll explain why he's on the mountain.
That explains why he's on the mountain. That is correct. Yep. But he did show up. They also found out that he did not have a pilot's license. So, a little bit of poor, bad company management, I guess, maybe not checking your references. But he would disappear, and we actually don't know what happened to him, but he never worked on Lake Champlain again. Meanwhile, John Eldridge actually continued to have a very successful career on the lake. He started serving on the lake since he was 12 years old as a cabin boy, and would go all the way up into his 90s, and had about an 80-year period of serving in steamboats on Lake Champlain. He was a very well-respected captain. And this happened right about in the middle of his career, so yeah. So another iconic wreck is the General Butler. This is actually right outside of Burlington, just off the breakwater. That's because it crashed into the breakwater. So this is what's known as a sailing canal boat, or a canal schooner. So this is one of the later versions of canal boats that we saw on Lake Champlain. It has to do with the fact that there was so much commerce going through the canal system that there was actually 2 separate expansions on the canals to make them bigger, to allow larger boats. So the first ones actually didn't have any sails, and they would be formed up into long trains that were pulled by a steamboat. And then as the first expansion happens, we have canal sloops, and then the second expansion we get canal schooners, where they have 2 masts versus the 1 mast on the sloops. It was built in Essex, New York in 1862, so it was built right here on the lake. And it actually had a very long career. It was on the lake for about 14 years, which is actually pretty good for a canal boat. You know, usually about a decade was good. 14 years is very good. It sunk on December 9th, 1876, so the year after Champlain 2. Just outside of Burlington, a big gale came in, and it's getting pretty late in the year already, and so winter's already setting in the lake. As they're coming into Burlington Harbor, the tiller snapped, and they lost control of the boat and were basically at the will of nature. Before the captain, William Montgomery, was able to jerry-rig a new tiller, they crashed into the breakwaters, which ruptured the hull. Thankfully, everyone on the ship was able to escape, and they were able to get on the breakwater. Unfortunately, it's December, and it's getting cold. So there was a concern that they were going to freeze to death. Thankfully, ship chandler James Wakefield and his son were able to row out there and rescue all of them that night and get them all safely into Burlington. This is also why we have the Wakefield rowing event in Burlington, is to honor this event. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. One of my favorite shipwrecks of Lake Champlain is the steamboat Phoenix. So this is one of the earliest steamboats on Lake Champlain. It's also one of the oldest steamboats in the archaeological record. So it was launched in 1815, and it was built by the Lake Champlain Steamboat Company. This is the second commercial steamboat that served on Lake Champlain. Interestingly enough, there's a story that was cursed by a witch because they wouldn't let her board the vessel, and that's why it caught fire. So it would traditionally travel between Whitehall, New York, and St. John's, Quebec, and stop at all the ports along the way. Steamboats are very nice compared to canal boats because they have a regular schedule. They don't have to worry about winters. They can, or the wind or anything like that. They could run all season long as the lake's not frozen, and they could keep a regular schedule. Unfortunately, it only had about a 4-year life because in September of 1819, it caught fire, and the paddle wheels actually fell off the boat, and it was on its routine trip from Burlington to Plattsburgh, so it's actually pretty close to Burlington. And it was a tragic wreck. So out of the 46 passengers that were on board, passengers and crews that were on board, only a dozen were able to make it into 2 of the rafts. Another 6 were rescued, but the remaining 6, it was all but a dozen made it on to the wreck. The remaining 6 did perish in the wreck, in the cold waters on the lake, so they weren't able to rescue everyone. It later crashed into Colchester Shoal and would sit there, and it was salvaged by, I believe it was salvaged by the company. They took off the steam parts, steam engine and all those, as they were pretty expensive at the time. And then as the ice froze, it actually picked up the wreck off the shoal and shifted it out, and as that ice melted, it dropped it off into a pretty deep part of the lake. This is actually a pretty common occurrence. Ice is very good at moving shipwrecks that are on the surface of the water. A similar thing happened to the Champlain too, where the ice picked it up and shifted it off. Thankfully for the Champlain too, it's actually in nice shallow water still. The Phoenix is now sitting close to 100 feet of water, and it becomes a very cold dive once you get down that deep. We were diving in on June, and the bottom temperatures at the deeper part of the wreck were in the upper 30s. It was definitely one of the coldest dives I've ever had. So the wreck was later identified in 1978 and has been the object of continuous research since. So you can see in the top right corner, that is George Swalls of the U.S. Navy Heritage and History Command on the left. In the middle is Chris Sabick, who's the executive director of the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, and on the right is Kevin Crispin of Texas A&M. So just back in 2021, they pulled up the bearing block that would have held one of the axles for the wreck, which is really unique because it doesn't go through like most of the bearing blocks do. It actually has a wall on the outside. So we are working on conserving that and trying to figure out why is it look so different from all the other steamboats that we know about. It's very interesting. Another one of my favorite wrecks is the horse ferry. This is actually a very popular one. So this is an animal-powered ferry. So while the shift from sailing to steamboats is happening, we see a sort of alternative path start to form where they were using animals to power the boats, so that way they could kind of keep up with steamboats. They were first introduced in about 1814 is when we saw the first one on the lake. They were pretty common, and then as steamboat technology became more affordable and more stable, they quickly got taken over by the steamboat industry. However, they were always really good for those really narrow areas of the lake, particularly in the south and in the north, where you don't need to go very far. So there's not really a good reason to waste a steamboat on that when you have a perfectly good animal-powered ferry. So they would last for a couple of decades until about 1840. This is one of the only archaeological turntable teamboats, as they were known as, in North America. So we actually don't know what boat this is. We call it the horse ferry because we know it was probably powered by horses based off of the archaeological remains, but we don't know when it sank, we don't know what the boat was, we don't know where it was built, anything like that. So it is a wreck that is still continuously researched to this day. Unfortunately, it is being incredibly threatened by zebra mussels, which are, growing on the wreck, causing it to deteriorate, more faster than it normally would, and also adds a lot of sediment to the wreck.
Where's it located?
This is in Burlington Bay. Yeah. So it's just north of on the north end of the bay. It's just outside of North Beach. I think maybe like half mile or so off the beach. So it's heavily documented, but we are still constantly researching and stuff like that. It's really fascinating because, as you can see on the top part of the image, there's a big turntable that would have actually sat underneath the deck, and there would have been two openings on the side where horses would have stood, and they would have powered, walked and moved that wheel. Apparently before, they had the horses like walking around, and then they'd get like halfway out to the lake and they would stop because they would get confused, I guess, because they're walking in a circle while also being jolted around by the waves. If I was a horse, I would too. One of the tragic things that we do experience on the lakes is the fact that a lot of these boats had families on board. So if they weren't, passengers, they were moving cargo, and these canal boats and these lake schooners like the Water Witch had whole families that were living on board all year round. And they would go, when they would dock for the winter, they would have whole communities, they would play bands, things like that. Kids would go to school, but they all lived on the boat. So the Water Witch was originally constructed to be a steamboat in 1832 by Jahaziel Sherman, who lived in Vergennes. He was a very well-known steamboat builder in North America. It was acquired by the Champlain Transportation Company, who was the same ones that had the Champlain II. They acquired it in 1835, mostly because they were trying to control the steamboat industry on the lake. They did become quite a sizable monopoly. So they decided, we don't want this to be a steamboat. We're going to make it into a lake schooner. And that's what they did. And surprisingly, it actually ran for 34 years, which is a remarkable life on Lake Champlain. But we don't actually know what the routine operations were for this vessel. We don't know yet what, was it typically transporting cargo or people, things like that. Where was it going? Where is it coming from? We're still working on figuring that out because it didn't really show up in a lot of the historical records. So we're still sussing that out. In 1866, a powerful gale came and actually rolled the boat over onto its side while it was transporting iron ore. So that ore shifted and the wreck just went under rapidly. Unfortunately, Thomas Mock and his wife lived, and he was able to save 2 of the children. Unfortunately, their infant Roa was still in the cabin when the ship finally went under, and she perished with the wreck. So some of the shipwrecks that are not part of the dive preserve system, but are also very famous for Lake Champlain, particularly have to do with the Revolutionary War. This is the gunboat Spitfire. This is one of the last remaining vessels in Lake Champlain from Benedict Arnold's fleet that fought at the Battle of Valcour Bay in 1776. It sank while the American forces were retreating from the bay. It was sank pretty early in their retreat. It was located by the Lake Survey in 1997. It was originally dubbed the Missing Gunboat, or Wreck M, but then they were able to find the transcript by John Townsend, and they were able to identify this as the Spitfire. So currently we are working on a research design for doing excavations on the Spitfire. We have a grant that we won from the National Parks American Battlefield Protection Program to develop a research design that is being peer reviewed by a committee. So we're working on that, and we're hoping, in the next couple of years that we'll have a very solid research design and be able to do some work on Spitfire, because nobody's been able to dive on it. It's actually deeper than the recreational diving limits of the wreck. So we require technical divers to help us out on that one. So I could go to about 130 feet. This is well past that. It's closer to about 200 feet. So then the last wreck that I'll talk about, and this has to do with the current work that we are wrapping up, but we're also hoping to kind of continue moving into the future. We're sort of in a lull right now with this work as we apply for more grants to continue our work, is the Rogue Galley Congress. So this was Benedict Arnold's flagship at the very end of the Valcour Island. So this is the ship that he finally, transferred his command to at the end as the American forces were in retreat. His original flagship, the Royal Savage, had sunk at the very early in the battle. The Royal Galley Washington that he had later transferred to was captured. So now he was on the Royal Galley Congress. As they sailed past what was then known as Ferris Bay, which was owned by the family the Ferrises, which is what Ferrisburg is named after. They were a patriot family. He swung around and was able to use the Americans' fleet, had the advantage of being able to sail upwind faster than the British ships were. So they sailed around, pulled into the bay, and outmaneuvered the British. And to prevent the ships from being captured, Benedict burns the remaining ships to the waterline, and that includes the Royal Galley Congress. So since the 1890s, the ships in that bay have been continuously salvaged. There are parts of this ship, along with 300 gunboats that were pulled up. Unfortunately, all the remains of these ships that were pulled up have since disintegrated. So it's very tragic because we've lost all of that information, and we actually don't fully know how the row galleys were built. We have the Philadelphia that's told us how the gunboats were built, and that's how we were able to reconstruct the Philadelphia II, which is sitting on our lawn right now at the museum. But when it comes to the gunboat Philadelphia, but when it comes to the row galleys, we don't have a very full understanding. We know what they look like, but we don't know how they were built. So that is some of the questions that we're trying to answer, as well as figure out how much of the remains are still there in Arnold's Bay. So this started in 2020 and continued into 2023. It largely focused on doing metal detection transects. We actually didn't expect to find much of anything in Arnold's Bay, as about 200 years or 150 years or so of it being salvaged. Probably means that there wasn't a whole lot left. We ended up finding about 1,500 artifacts in total that we are still working on conserving. So there was actually a huge amount of material still left, and we're actually pretty sure that there's more of the wreck that we still have not even found yet. That's been broken up and things like that. So we are hoping to go back in the next couple of years to go investigate that further. Unfortunately, it is a time-consuming process because this wreck, as well as all military vessels in Lake Champlain, is still owned by the U.S. Navy, which means we have to apply for a permit, and then they tell us, if we could go work on it or not. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm a sailor, and I've done some sailing on Lake Champlain and moored and anchored a number of times in Arnold's Bay. So my anchoring there isn't going to damage or...
So it's underneath all of the mud, so you're probably okay. Thank you for asking. For those of you that can hear, is anchoring in Arnold's Bay going to damage the wreck? No, probably not. Particularly where it is in the bay, it's probably not where you're going to be mooring. It's in one of the shallower sides of the bay, because he did pull it up as far as he could go before he burned it down. It's actually pretty close to where the Middlebury College docks are. And so, we are still working on conserving and analysis of all the materials that we covered. As I mentioned, we had the Middlebury High School boat builders, and they saw some of the fishing hooks that we found. They're very excited about it, and that actually still needs to go through conservation. It's probably going to be the next going into the tank. There was so much stuff there that we were not expecting to find. It was pretty remarkable, and we definitely need to go back and visit it. So this is On the right, this is a photogrammetric model, 3D model of the remains of Congress. This is what we excavated at the end of 2023. So this is all 3 years worth of work, and the model that you see on the left is the plans, and the red section is the section that we have located of the wreck, which is actually pretty remarkable. We did not expect to find this. We were kind of expecting to find a bunch of like disarticulated timbers and things like that. And the fact that we found a whole section is amazing, and we're pretty sure that there's still more there. So just to wrap up, yeah, there's a lot of shipwrecks in Lake Champlain. Like I said, we know of about 200. We could predict that there's probably another 100 that we don't know about that are, you know, laying in shallow bays and in shorelines and all sorts of places that we have not been able to access yet. And there's only 4 archaeologists at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, and one of them is our executive director. So, you know, there's a lot for us to do. So, but there's also a lot of underwater explorers, you know, people that like to go diving, people that like to use ROVs and go explore the lake bottom. So I am really hoping that we can kind of harness that power and, you know, get them to start contributing scientific data and create a citizen science program where they can help us understand the shipwrecks of Lake Champlain better and give us, you know, data and stuff like that, and then we can then in turn turn that data into better interpretive material to teach you guys and the general public altogether. So, like I said, we are monitoring through the Dive Preserve program 12 shipwrecks, but there's also a whole bunch of other shipwrecks that we do take a look at, but only about 60 of them are fully mapped archaeologically. So we still have a lot of work to go, and the more, you know, we use citizen science to help us out, the faster we can kind of complete that project. So right now, we really only rely on divers that, you know, self-report. If they see something, they may or may not tell us, but that's sort of what we're relying on right now, and usually it's just an email or a conversation or a phone call. I'm really hoping to create a system where they can open up a form and tell us like, hey, is everything looking good? Or hey, is, you know, I'm noticing something that's not, like there's been an explosion of zebra mussels, or, you know, something happened and, you know, the wreck's been damaged. So, you know, we have a huge community that's super interested in our shipwrecks, particularly the diving community, and we really just want to get those people on board as, you know, volunteers and helping us out on these projects. So part of what that looks like is to train divers to use GoPros underwater, so we could create 3D models, so they could go in, use the GoPro, take a bunch of photos, and create a big model, and we could use that model from year to year to year to compare the changes that have been happening. And we also create our own 3D models at a slightly different level. We're not using GoPros, but using a full functioning underwater camera, and, you know, it's got a lot more detail, but if we can still document changes with these GoPro models, then it can actually still tell us a lot, because even going down and doing the photos still takes up a lot of our time. And these GoPro, the models that are made with the GoPro cameras go a lot faster. So yeah, so that's all I have. I think Jen, are we looking good on time?
Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask Taylor?
Are the zebra mussels at great depth as well?
So the deepest wreck that I've seen them at is Phoenix. So they're sitting at just above 100 feet. Once you start to go past that, and even then they're pretty scarce. So because they don't like that cold water, they are showing up at those deeper wrecks, but we're pretty sure what's happening is they're on a piece of timber that then gets moved and shifted down to a deeper depth. So they're basically being transplanted from warmer instead of spreading naturally. Because they really like warm water, they'll reproduce in about 60-degree water to 70-degree water, which is what we've been experiencing a lot lately on the lake.
And another question, what is the shipwreck in Whitehall, New York on display?
Shipwreck in Whitehall, I don't know that one actually.
What's the
Birthplace of the Navy, and there's a shipwreck.
I think Tycon Road is in Shelburne. Tycon Road is the one in Shelburne.
That was a cruise ship. The one in Whitehall was a U.S. Navy.
Oh, okay.
And it was the Battle of 1812.
Yeah, okay, yes. It's the USS Tycon Road.
It was sunk in that bay just north of that and burned, and so that's what
Okay,
was left was the.
gotcha. I don't actually know. I would assume that if it's out of the water that they have stabilized it, especially if it's, a Navy ship. They have very strict conservation protocols. So I would assume that, USS Ticonderoga would have been conserved. Thank you for the clarification.
Before USS Tycon.
Yeah. I thought you were talking about Steamboat Ticonderoga, which is the one in Shelburne. Yeah. And so that is actually Commodore McDonough's flagship from the Battle of Balfour Bay. Battle of Plattsburgh Bay. Wrong war. For the War of 1812. Yeah.
If you're going to put something in this tank to get the rust off, are you pretty sure that there's something there that the rust will come off, or what? Has anything ever just totally disappeared?
Yeah, so that's actually a really great question. So for those of you that couldn't hear, when we put an artifact in electrolysis to remove the rust, how do we know that there's something there, and is it possible for it to just completely disintegrate while going through electrolysis? That's a great question. So unfortunately the answer is yes. Sometimes things do just completely disintegrate. It's really hard to tell if there's something there. We could be putting it through x-ray, but even then, we can still be getting a false positive through x-ray, and that also gets really expensive. You do see that in a lot of ocean environments where the rust will also attract rocks and sediment, and you'll get these big concretions that can have a whole bunch of artifacts inside, and you have to, literally break apart all of the sand and all of the rocks that have been attached to this big rust ball. So, to make sure you're spending a good amount, the right time on it, they'll x-ray it and they'll make sure that there are artifacts inside, and then they'll develop a conservation plan. We don't really have that problem here. Right now I have one, I think it's about a 2-pound camera, it might be a great shot. It's a little bit hard to tell because the shape's a little wonky. I have one of those that has a bunch of sand built up around it. It's being very difficult to conserve. It literally is like I'm breaking off pieces and they're flying across the lab because of how much force I have to put on them. It's kind of hilarious. But, most of the time we can't tell. And because we don't live in a saltwater environment, the fresh water is actually good for making sure that they don't, disintegrate too quickly. But there are a couple of times where if we have something that's like really thin, it's like, yeah, it looks like an artifact. It is an artifact, but it's all the way rusted through and it, will disintegrate in that. But we try to make sure that doesn't happen.
So I love the idea of citizen science, and I think that's great. Is there any concern about the opposite happening, of humans going in and damaging or pilfering any of these?
Yeah, it's...
And what's being done to prevent that?
Yeah, so it's a double-edged sword, right? So doing these public outreach programs like this, or getting talks to divers and things like that, is one of the main tools that we use to prevent that from happening, but also the site inspections. For these dive preserves, we do remove the artifacts, so that way they can't be stolen. We can document exactly where they go. But yeah, it is a problem where it could be used against the preservation of the shipwrecks, and people could be removing it. Right now, the plan is only to use remote sensing, so cameras and things like that, so they can document it. And the idea is through the trainings to instill a sense of stewardship, to really, make it clear, like, these shipwrecks are not renewable. Anything you take off them, anything you destroy or damage, we cannot replace, and we lose that data forever. And I'm really hoping that as we instill that sense of preservation and stewardship to those citizen sciences, they then, you know, as they go out and they go do dives with their buddies, they instill that onto them. Of course, there will always be people that would prefer just to take stuff, but we're really hoping that through having, you know, a community that really cares about the shipwrecks, which we do, that it's not going to happen. Dan, you had a question?
Are you using a digital printer to copy your artifacts since you're going to throw them back into the water again when you're done with them?
Well, like the 3D print them?
Yes.
Yes, so the question was, do we 3D print artifacts that we return to the water? Not right now, but that is a really good idea, and I would love to do that. Our education department just got a 3D printer, but they're using it to print like little models of the shipwrecks that they can use on the Great Map, and also just education material. We do work with Castleton College actually, because they have an amazing 3D scanning and 3D printing lab. So we actually had a super amazing intern this summer who was from Castleton, and she was helping us, you know, update our collections, and she also did a bunch of 3D scanning projects and stuff like that. And so we are hoping to implement that, but actually for material that can be put on display without risk of it getting damaged. So right now, if you go and check our Key to Liberty exhibit, you see the exploded cannon from the gunboat New York. We're really hoping to 3D scan that and create a 3D print so we can, you know, have an interactive display so you can see like all of the different chunks, because we have almost all of it, but not all of it's on display. It's just far too heavy and too big. It would take up so much space, like that exhibit. We don't have so much space, right? And I would love to just have the entire cannon on display, but through 3D printing, we can do that. And, you know, people can go in, they can get their hands on it and see how things go back together. They can see the textures and things like that, and, you know, kind of get a tactile feel. It's not going to be the same. It's not going to have that same weight and stuff like that, unless we get really creative, which is something I have thought about a lot, actually. I don't have a solution for you yet, but we can create a tactile experience for people through 3D printing. But we do always photograph, and we are working on creating a 3D scan or photometric library of all the stuff that we have. So that way, if we do put stuff back, we have a really nice model of it. Oh goodness.
One more. Lois McClure, what is her current status?
Actually, that's a great question. I just found out this morning. They just pulled her out of the water yesterday. She's over with the Canal Boat Society over on the other side of the lake. And yeah, they just used this huge crane. I think she's in Montezuma, New York right now. They used this huge crane, it's on their Facebook page, to pull her out of the water. That was just such a cool ship, but it's looking pretty rough right now. I'm a little worried that we're not going to get too much time with it, unfortunately. That one did not sink, but it was getting there. So now it's going to go sit. I believe their plan. I can't speak to this because I don't really know the folks there. This is just what I've heard. Is that it's going to go sit in one of the canal blocks. It's going to be, effectively a dry dock.
How do you know initially where to go finding boats? Like, what is your initial first step? There are 200 boats there.
To find shipwrecks?
Yeah.
Yeah. So our initial first step in finding shipwrecks, that's such a great question, is to do things like our side scan survey, but also doing historical research. So a lot of times, we'll go through the historical record, we'll figure out, a newspaper article or a personal letter or something like that talks about a shipwreck that occurred. In fact, actually, just earlier this week, we had somebody who came in and was talking to us about, his family was on a boat, and several members of his family died, when the boat sank 100 and something years ago. and he told us like where it's at and stuff like that, based off of like the family legend. So all of these things help add it up. So it's basically like a big puzzle. As we start to figure out the location of where these shipwrecks are, then we go dive and explore those wrecks, and we basically verify locations and whatnot.
Thank you.
So this great project, or not so great project, depending on how you're looking at it, where they're laying this cable all the way from Quebec to New York City, and you guys helped map the entire floor of Lake Champlain. Did you find any wonderful surprises in that whole project?
So I got brought into this project pretty late. There are some pretty interesting targets that we're sort of suspicious about. One of the ones that I did identify recently, actually, there's an interesting pile of rocks near a historic fort. I won't say which one, but it's near a historic fort. And it's just outside of where they're laying the line, but you know, it has the potential to be a shipwreck. It does sort of look like it could be a ballast pile, and it's, you know, a couple hundred feet off the shore. So it's definitely very interesting. Yeah, it's, indeed. Yeah, it's very interesting feature that we saw on the bottom. But for the most part, they want us to, you know, use the new data that they collected, combine it with the old data that we have, and tell them, you know, where the wrecks are so they can avoid that. So that one didn't necessarily generate a lot of new data, but it did generate some. So, like I said, yeah, there was, you know, we were talking about 20-year difference in technology from the sonar that we use for the lake survey versus the sonar they used just a few years ago to clear the line.
Do they actually zigzag around what you find?
Yeah. So there's some tricks to it because apparently there's only so much mobility in the cable, but they will go around the wrecks. It's tricky. I leave that to them to figure out. It's not my job. I just tell them where to avoid. But yeah, they will, you know, move the line to avoid it, and then while they're near a wreck that's sensitive, they have cameras and like a cool sonar scanner that they rig up, and then we watch to make sure they're not damaging anything. It's pretty cool. Yeah. Sometimes I love my job. Can you tell?
Any insights into which shipwrecks you're considering to open for future underwater preservation?
No insights yet, because we just added two. So we just added this year. We added the Providence Island Canal boat and the Potash Canal boat. So I think you know, we're going to see how those two go, and adding more might come in the next couple of years. So I don't have the answer for that.
And we can find the information for those 12 sites on the website?
Yes. Yeah, all of the information you need to know, including to register for this site, is on our website. So yeah, you go on, if you're a diver, you go register, and then there's all the information about the wreck, including information about, you know, what type of diving experience we would recommend, and, you know, what type of dive you can expect. So something like the Water Witch, which is right at the mouth of Otter Creek. That's a pretty tough dive. I am a pretty experienced diver, and I would probably still be challenged on that dive. Even deploying an ROV, which I did about a month ago onto that wreck, I was like, I'm going to bring this ROV up. I don't want to run into the wreck because it's so dark down there, and you can get such a good current from the creek that it could, you know, be pretty hazardous. So, yeah, and it's dark too. You know, you're, you know, just seeing a couple of feet down there.
I take it that as the season would progress closer to winter, I take it would get to be more dangerous. I'm not talking about a battle, but just
Yeah.
And then you're starting to weigh like risk versus making money and to get one more trip across.
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, you know, the risk assessment that these captains were making, you know, was constant. So, yeah, as we get, later into the year, storms pick up, they get more dangerous, and as you saw, a lot of the wrecks that happen to a natural gale were happening in the winter when the storms were the strongest, where it seems like our summer and spring wrecks tend to be more user error. Or substance abuse error, maybe. So they were constantly making those judgments. And it also depends on, are they working independently or do they work for companies, things like that. So, yeah. And sometimes there's necessity too. That all comes in as a factor, if they needed to make the money or these goods need to be transported, then they have to, risk it.
Storms can come up pretty fast.
They can, yeah, especially, we're seeing that change now in the summer where we're starting to get these big storms, just the last 2 or 3 years on the lake. When we were diving on Phoenix back in June, like the thunderstorms would just come up quickly on us and, we have to scurry back to shore, before we get hit by a big thunderstorm because it's dangerous out there. You have a big aluminum boat and there's nothing else around you. Yeah. Any other questions?
I think we could all stay much longer and listen to Taylor. He was absolutely wonderful. You've been a great audience. We had a great speaker. If you'd like to volunteer and be part of bringing more exciting lectures through OSHA, please contact Kathy or Melanie and Bernie or Dan on your way out. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.